de excepción con Sara Maitland. Voy a hacer una breve introducción y luego nos hablará ella. ¿Funciona bien la traducción? Bueno, de momento no es necesaria, ¿no? Esta es tu traducción, vale.
Good heavens. Now I can, yeah.
Bueno, Sara Maitland, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí y a la térmica por hacer lo posible y a ustedes por venir. Sara Maitland, he leído, es una hija de familia numerosa y ruidosa. ¿Es eso cierto?
Yes.
Bueno,
My sister's here.
sí, es una de las ruidosas. ¿Qué tal?
She's very noisy. She's one of the very noisy ones.
También tiene fama de una chica rebelde, sobre todo en la universidad. Bueno, ella estudió filología inglesa en Oxford a finales de los 60. Allí descubrió muchas cosas, el feminismo de la segunda ola, el socialismo, la cristiandad y el cristianismo, y la amistad, ¿no? Que, como ella misma dice en su web, que les recomiendo, es muy interesante, saramaitland.com, ha sido la amistad la base de su vida, ¿no? Uno de los pilares de su vida. De hecho, en Oxford trabó amistad con un hombre que luego fue muy célebre, con Bill Clinton, ¿no? ¿Mantienes la amistad con Bill Clinton?
Not so much. It's very hard to be friends with the president.
Really? We might get questions about this later. Bueno, entonces, me ha contado cosas muy especiales.
No, I didn't. The answer to any question is no, I personally didn't.
Okay.
Okay?
Muy bien. Así no hay más preguntas. En 1995 colaboró con Stanley Kubrick en una anécdota muy divertida que me acaba de contar. Le llama un señor, se pone al teléfono y le dice: hola, soy Stanley Kubrick y quiero que me escriba un guión. Y ella le dice: sí, yo soy Marilyn Monroe, solo que llevo 20 años muerta. Resulta que, claro, no le creyó, pero era verdad. Era Stanley Kubrick, que había conseguido su teléfono a través de su editor en lugar de a través de su agente. Bueno, el caso es que hizo este guión que luego tuvo una vida un poco complicada y que no se hizo, lo cual es muy silencio, ¿no? También para entrar en una cosa que al final ocurra, pero de otra forma, y ella queda en otro lugar. Ella siempre estaba interesada por la religión. De hecho, uno de sus libros más famosos es Daughter of Jerusalem, la hija de Jerusalén, que fue el premio Somerset Maugham en 1979, y se casó con un sacerdote anglicano y luego se convirtió al catolicismo. Ella tiene dos hijos mayores, dos hijos que, cuando se hicieron mayores, pues ella, que ya lo son, se dedicó más a la plegaria y se mudó a esta...
No. One of them is a girl.
One is a girl,
and
yes.
she's expecting her baby today. So.
No, but in Spanish we jump, you kind of collapse genders. If there's male and female, we say hijos as if it was male. Yes, it's very criticized in feminism, as you might know.
No, it's very good.
Well, I'm not sure, but anyway. El caso es que ella se dedicó más a la plegaria, se mudó al norte de Escocia, al noroeste, a una isla muy, muy bonita y bastante remota que se llama Skye, y luego se trasladó otra vez a la isla grande, a Gran Bretaña, y vive en Galloway. Este viaje autobiográfico es el que describe en su libro Viaje al silencio, de la editorial Alba, que les recomiendo encarecidamente si no lo conocen, porque es una auténtica maravilla. En la actualidad ella vive, como decía, en este páramo escocés, una casa preciosa que la pueden también ver en su web y que tiene una hermosa pieza de literatura dedicada de una escritora británica. Y está allí, vive sin redes, sin móvil, solo contesta el mail una vez a la semana, no tiene televisión, da clases en la Universidad de Lancaster en un máster de creative writing, de escritura creativa, pero a distancia. Ha escrito decenas de libros de ficción y de no ficción, que es imposible listarlos todos ahora, pero quería solo pensar en el último, que se llama Las migraciones sin retorno. Es decir, ella lo que hace es contrastar la idea de Odiseo, un viaje, ¿no?, que va a volver, es una vuelta, un viaje que tiene una vuelta, ¿no?, que retorna, pero que es un estilo parecido, como ella dice, a alguno de sus otros libros, que mezcla estilos literarios, lo cual resulta muy interesante y muy atrevido, y la hace una escritora y ensayista muy original. Bueno, hoy, como saben, nos va a hablar de Alguien me escucha, el silencio en la naturaleza. Así que no diré más, porque todos sabemos que hemos venido aquí a escucharla a ella. Y te dejo con el público. Luego habrá una sesión de there's going to be a bit of questions and so on. ¿Ok? Muchas gracias. Gracias.
Thank you. Say something. Okay, it's working. Well, thank you for having me. That's really nice. I've never been in Spain before, and we've had my sister and I decided to take a holiday together, and it's been wonderful. I also have to tell you that I've never had a simultaneous interpreter before, and it's very strange. I want to talk tonight about silence in nature. There's lots of ways of talking about silence, historical ways. My book about it is more philosophical, a philosophy of language book. But I'm going to talk about it more casually. In British culture, and I suspect from the great interest there's been in a book of silence, which I wrote 10 years ago, I suspect in other developed cultures as well, there's a tendency to treat silence. What happens if I turn you off, Mr. Interpreter? I'm sorry, I just find this quite difficult.
Actually, you shouldn't be hearing him.
Well, I am hearing him.
Okay, well, then it's easily solved. You don't need to wear that.
Ah.
Yeah, that was for translating me.
Oh, yeah, it works for that. It's very strange hearing everything you're saying simultaneously in a language you don't understand a word of.
I'm going to speak this on.
Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. It was just quite a strange experience. I want to talk tonight about silence in the natural world because I think, for a number of reasons which I hope will come out of the paper, but I live in a culture, and I suspect it's true elsewhere, where silence is by and large regarded as an absence, a lack of something else, a hole, a vacancy, which may or may not need to be filled, but is an absence, a void. In English, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is our authoritative thing, our authoritative dictionary, silence has two meanings, and they're very clearly in conflict. Silence is either an absence of language, or it's an absence of sound. Now, obviously, those are quite different things. It throws out the really interesting question about whether or not reading is a silent activity. 100% language, 0% sound. Is that silent or not silent? And I think that conflict, or conflicted feelings about silence, have affected contemporary culture, actually, in some ways that I hope are interesting. They're interesting to me. In German, there are two different nouns for silence. Stille, which has a more positive nuance of stillness, calm, peace, and Schweigen, which is more physical, has no emotional load at all. It's just what you can or can't hear. I don't know how it works in Spanish. My computer gave me only one noun, silencio, but 7 verbs for imposing it. So we have, in English, to silence is the verb for to make other people silent. It's a verb. To be silent, that is for yourself to be silent, is an adjective. As I say, the simultaneous translator gave me 7 verbs for making people be quiet, but actually all website translators are useless. Well, they're very crude. So I'll have to leave that one with you as to what sort of nuance, positive, negative, different words for silence in Spanish are. We're a bit short of them, which is very unusual, of course, because English has the largest vocabulary of any language ever. It's very unusual for us to have fewer, in this case, verbs than you do. But at whatever level of consciousness that we see silence as a lack, an absence, anything that we feel is a lack or absence, we tend to think of as bad, as negative, as dangerous. For example, I have never been able to find any tradition that has a silent heaven. If you have a heaven at all, if there is some place after life, it is never silent. The noisiest heaven that I've been able to track down, whether or not you'd find this fun or not, slightly different, the Vikings, the Norsemen, had the noisiest heaven. One of the things they were going to do in Valhalla was break the china. This was going to be the great positive experience, ideally by throwing it at the wall. There was going to be a lot of crashing and banging. Everybody's going to sit at a great banqueting table and shout at each other and periodically get up and fight. This was their idea of complete delight. All right? But even in a more peace-orientated heaven, like a traditional Christian heaven, it wasn't going to be silent. It was going to be lots and lots of music. All those poor harps, I've always felt a bit sorry for harpists. After all that time, you go to heaven and once you get another harp. But angelic singing, human singing, and music, it is not going to be silent in our traditional heaven, presumably because you cannot have any lack in heaven. In the perfect world, there will not be lack, there will not be absence. And I think the fact that nobody's ever imagined a happily silent heaven is because we think of silence as an absence of the good. Now, some of this is obviously a direct effect of modernity. About 150 to 100 years ago, we got an idea that we were all working too hard. And do you know something? We probably were. So people started to invent labor-saving or time-saving devices. The time-saving devices have proved completely useless. People still spend exactly the same amount of time cleaning their house. There has been very few hours saved because what we've done is thought of more things to clean. So, 19th century, you wore your knickers, all the same pair of underpants all through the winter. Now you have to have a clean pair every day. That means you've multiplied your washing by 7 days a week for 6 months of the year. I think that it's very curious that this labour-saving device has not, in fact, eased the primary burden on women at all. This is worth thinking about. But I think more to the point, one of the things, or more to the point of this lecture, so one of the things we failed to notice is that every labour-saving device is noisier than the thing it replaces. The only exception to this is probably the bicycle. But, a horse makes more noise than feet. A car makes more noise than a horse. And an aeroplane, which goes fastest and saves the most time, makes the most noise with more. A hairdryer makes more noise than a towel. And a towel makes more noise than sunshine. Every time we think of a way to make things easier for ourselves, they're always noisier. In consequence of which, we are raising the noise level in the world, but to an extraordinary degree, actually. And it's also the case that there are far more people than there used to be, and more people make a lot more noise than less people. All right? So it's not anybody's fault that everything is so loud, but equally, none of us seem to be doing very much about it. For example, I know lots of eco-warriors, including my nieces, my son, and everybody else, people who do genuinely change their own behaviours and frequently harass others to change theirs. I'm a bit of an eco-warrior myself, really, but I hope I don't do the harassing. But I don't know anyone who is what you might call a phono-warrior, who goes around militantly trying to make things quieter. And nobody talks about lowering your audio footprint to protect the world, or nobody feels free to tell strangers to be quiet and not talk on their mobile phone because it disturbs my reading on the train. You'd be a weirdo to do that. Whereas, in fact, people tell me not to smoke in exactly the places, but total strangers will tell you not to smoke. So we're not very resistant to the increase of noise. There used to be public spaces where silence was normal. I mean, church would be a good example, but libraries? Libraries are a really interesting one because when people first started reading in libraries, they couldn't read silently. I won't explain why that's the case, but it is the case. And so it's not until about the 10th century that you start getting instructions to keep silent in a library. And that's because people had learned to read without moving their lips. Prior to that, they couldn't. So all libraries were at least of lip noise, and a lot of people read as they spoke. But when I was growing up, you did not talk in the public library. You didn't talk in church. You sort of whispered in art galleries. And at the domestic level, children's bedrooms in those houses, lucky enough to have bedrooms for their children, children's bedrooms were predominantly silent. Some children were allowed to read in bed once there was a light to do it, but we, as children, were not supposed to talk to each other after bedtime. We certainly didn't have mobile phones, our own television, and something to make music on. Bedrooms were silent. There was basically we're less and less resistant to noise. We're quite passive about living in noise. And because we live in such a noisy world, we've come to see silence not only as a scary absence, but also as something unnatural. A lot of people will say to me of my chosen lifestyle, it's not natural to be alone. It's not natural to be quiet so much of the time. The kind of joke version of it is you're either sad or you're mad or you're bad. My mother decided bad was the way forward. It was selfish. It was selfish to live in silence. I'm not quite sure why something so horrible was also selfish, but that would be a typical response to it, that it's both a horrible lifestyle, what's the matter with you, and at the same time a deeply selfish lifestyle. I think we've got deeply confused about what we mean by natural and unnatural. So when we talk about silence in nature, we're talking about something that is philosophically quite complicated. Now, I do believe that trying to claim silence is not as unnatural is not very helpful, mainly because there is so much silence in the natural world. And in order to understand why that is, I'm going to dive very simply into some of the science of sound and how it actually works. Sound is carried on waves, sound waves, as they're called, in English anyway, which are longitudinal waves. That means they vibrate in the same direction as they travel. That is, you get a fairly straight line between the source of the sound and, right, they may travel in a circle out in lots of directions, but once they start traveling, it's linear. There's other sorts of waves which we'll come to which aren't. But to put it crudely, sound waves as a question of a molecule, they start a vibration, and a molecule bumps into the next molecule, which bumps into the next one and into the next one. That's how they travel in this linear way by molecule bumping. This means there is no sound in space. Or you go outside, you look at those stars, it is, once you get about 80 kilometers away from this planet, you enter a 50 trillion mile zone of silence before you get to the next place, which has got the kind of atmospheres that allow there to be some molecules. No molecules, no sound. Sound travels more efficiently through solids, and then through liquids, and then through gases, but it does not travel at all unless it's got something to vibrate. So we live Now, actually, quite a lot of our planets have got some atmosphere, although it's not as dense as ours. So there's probably a little bit of noise very close to the ground on some of the planets. There's quite a lot of debate about which ones' atmospheres will carry sound and how far they carry it. But outside the solar system, we don't know. What we do know is that between the outer limits of our solar system and the next one, it is completely silent. So to say that silence is unnatural is extremely egotized, because most of it is horribly or beautifully, or whatever we want to say, the whole of space is silent. I found that kind of stunning, actually. I don't even know if I want it to be true. It's too much silence. Even for me, who's rather silence addicted, just seems 50 trillion miles of absolute silence. Convert that into kilometers, you've got even more of it. I can only do it in miles. There's the vast vacuity of silence. I find this sometimes quite scary, although must be scarier for people who are afflicted by panic attacks if they can't find their mobile phone for 2 minutes. You know, what's going on here? That we are this little tiny speck of sound, and there's none out there. So to say silence is unnatural is saying something very humanoid in a way, or certainly earthoid, disproportionately, I think. So if we're going to define natural as something like normal, which is pretty dubious, as I say, philosophical idea, it's not silence that's unnatural, but sound. Here we are, this tiny pinprick of noise, a minute aberration spinning through an infinitely large ocean of silence, a sort of dust mote adrift on a kind of empty, soundless world. And this idea that silence is somehow unnatural is, as I say, a bit egotizing, really. Now, actually, the same thing is true within the rather smaller amount of space with enough atmosphere to allow those sound waves to propagate, because so many, I'm being careful here not to say most, but the majority, just so many, of the forces which shape our natural environment are themselves silent. Light waves are silent. And light waves are a form of electromagnetic wave, and they oscillate, basically. And they're silent, and magnetic force is silent, and the force of gravity is silent. I mean, obviously, if you drop something, gravity causes it to crash to the ground, and it makes a noise, but the gravity itself doesn't make any noise. It's a silent force. It's a very strong force. It's why the Earth stays stuck together. It is silent. Electricity is silent, gravity is silent, magnetism is silent, solar rotation is silent, therefore the tidal forces are silent. There may be noisy consequences of them, like waves crashing on the thing, but the actual force is a silent force. Most of the natural forces, we'll come on to ones that aren't, but most of the natural forces are silent. And far from seeing silence as an absence or a lack, it is in the proper sense vital. It is life propagating. No silence, no life. Now, the really one that I want to talk about tonight in relation to us is that organic growth is silent. So even inside this noise-making planet, this absolute primary force is silent. Cell division is a silent force. It just doesn't make any noise. Now, a lot of people find that quite counterintuitive. Surely what she means is that organic growth happens very quietly. But actually the process is silent. It generates not the sort of vibrations that can turn into sound waves. It doesn't do it. Nothing vibrates. Now, at the heart of all organic growth is cell division. You know, if you're an amoeba, it's pretty simple. You duplicate your genome, you split it in half, and then you've got two of you, and then you all do it again, so that your great-great-grandmother is, in fact, your identical twin. There's no genome split. That is an unfair simplification, because you do get mutations in amoebas, which is lucky for us, because we are a mutation of amoebas. But the normal amoeba doing its normal amoeba thing is just simply replicates itself by division, silently. Right? It's just silent. Now, there are a variety of events that trigger this division, but it doesn't change the fact that all organic growth is cell division, and cell division is silent. This is quite strange if you think about it. I live in a very, very rural place, and I have about a hectare of garden. And because it is rather high and rather cold and rather wet and very, very windy, not a lot grows in my garden. Making a garden at the top of a moor in Scotland is hard work. So most of my garden is just down to rough grass, and it has a lot of bulbs planted in it. And I have to say, they're mostly daffodil bulbs, because English rodents don't eat daffodil bulbs. English rodents love iris bulbs. My sister and I have so loved your blue irises growing, as far as we can see, wild. For me to get an iris to grow requires so much netting, grip, protection. But so mostly I have daffodils. I've probably got about 1,000 daffodils. About the end of March, the daffodils grow about an inch a day, silently. I think that will be about 25 meters of vertical growth, and it makes no noise. I found that stunning, really. They just grow, and they grow because their cells are dividing. Millions and millions and millions of cells are dividing in my garden every day. That is sunny, which are not very many. But essentially, all that growth is silent. It doesn't make any noise. But the whole of that natural growth, it's not just cell division silent. Photosynthesis, which is the system that all plants use to convert light into nutrients. Osmosis, which is the hydraulic process that vascular plants use to lift water. They're lifting water to the top of trees, which can be over 50 meters high. It is silent. The idea that there is something unnatural about silence is pretty bizarre, actually. We have a very famous botanical garden in London called Kew Gardens, and they did an experiment to see if there's any way you could capture the sound of trees lifting liquid. And the only way you could was by converting rhythm into sound. You can't record the sound because there isn't any. I'm listening to it through these very peculiar earphones you needed. It was kind of fascinating to hear it go, whoop, whoop. But you don't hear it without a lot of intervention. Now, I've got two reasons for emphasizing, and I hope illuminating, these huge silent forces that structure and sustain both the universe on the largest scale and the daily intraterrestrial microscopic scale. And the first I mentioned at the beginning of this paper, there's a cultural dynamic which wants to treat silence as an artificially imposed absence from which we all need rescuing, which is why children far too small to use them competently now have mobile phones. Because for them to be silent or not able to talk to their mummy at any moment would be disastrous. And obviously there are certain circumstances it would be a bit disastrous, but I don't know how it is in Spain, but in England you'll be sitting with a household round a table where nobody's aiming for silence, and every single person in that family will be on their mobile phone. It's bizarre. So it's not just that they're not silent, it's that they're not actually communicating with the people who are near to them. They're moving away the point of communication, but it surely is not silent. And one of the things is you can talk to somebody on a mobile phone while the person next to you does. You can't have a conversation in which both people talk at once because you don't get any conversation. So we're generating an awful lot of noise in a kind of fear of silence, which isn't that. I honestly don't think it's very good for people. The other reason for talking about it is both odder and in many ways to me more interesting. Out there in the natural world, we don't experience silence very often. It's like, so I see it now as like mineral deposits, like, say, diamonds. They are completely natural, but they're not very common. And in fact, a lot of people would argue that it's never perfectly silent in the natural world. Yesterday, my sister and I went and had this walk in El Turcal, which is the limestone, extraordinary limestone park just south of, where's it just south of, Mike? What? That's right, thank you. It was incredibly beautiful, and because she's a great deal fitter than I am, we took separate walks, right? And we had a seriously lovely experience of peace. But as soon as I started thinking about this paper and listening, it wasn't actually silent. There were birds singing, because it has a kind of pebbly bottom. Every footstep I took made a noise. On her bit of walk, she saw more animals than I did, including sheep with this extraordinary bell noise your sheep make. Our sheep don't make such a nice noise as your sheep. There wasn't a lot of wind, but there was, in occasional places, the trees would be rustling. It was both an experience of silence and it wasn't silent. And just recently, well, it's not that recent, but fairly recently, people have been trying to look at what was happening if all these forces were silent. Why wasn't the consequence of that silence? If that makes sense. And a very interesting, I think, American writer called Bernie Krauser, who's been talking about soundscape to go with landscape. How do we, in English, the word for landscape was originally a word for a painting of land. It only came to mean, so it's a bit like calling all people portraits. That landscape was the thing out there that you were doing a painting of. It was the painting that was the landscape. Now landscape means the land around you. And Bernie Krauser has been working on how we can talk about soundscape and try and see the sort of whole pattern of it. Interestingly, he was a musician. Interestingly, because musicians are very often the people who write best about silence, of which John Cage, the person who wrote the 4 minutes and 33 second silent, do you know what I'm talking about? He plays on his piano. He doesn't play on the piano. The pianist comes in, they sit in front of the piano, they place their hands above the keys for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And he always argued that it was not about silence, it was to make people listen to how much noise there was in a concert hall. But I just think it's very interesting that musicians get very interested in silence. But Bernie Krauser has tried to break down the sounds we hear that aren't speech sounds. Speech sounds he's put into a different category. And he's decided the easiest way of doing this is to talk about geophonic sounds, biophonic and androphonic. And geophonic ones are those made by the forces of the earth, such as the wind, running water, volcanoes, if you happen to be near one, that would be very geophonic. Waves on a seashore, sounds that are made by, biophonic sounds are sounds that are made by biological things, birdsong, animal noises, both animal noises like the dog going woof, 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 but also animal noises like animals running through a wood. I don't know what animals you have that run through woods, but in Britain, foxes run pretty silently through woods, but deer run incredibly noisily through woods. But both of those would be biophonic sounds, and separate from that are androphonic sounds, which are sounds made by people, directly or indirectly. So voices, cars, aeroplanes, children, very noisy. It's actually not as simple, I don't think, as Bernie Krauser wants to make it. Because if the noise is the wind moving leaves on a tree and human beings have planted that particular tree, is that biophonic, androphonic, or geophonic? But it's quite interesting to think about, and the other thing he's very interested in is that human beings tend to prefer, when they're given a choice, except for music, to prefer biophonic sounds, then geophonic sounds, and to find androphonic sounds not made by themselves and people they immediately know the most difficult to deal with. And my experience of silence would back that up. The longest silence I've ever done has been 40 days, and I did it beside an extremely noisy rushing stream. And it did not occur to me till about day 38 that this was making more noise than the very occasional car changing gear, lorry particularly, changing gear on a road half a mile away, which I found completely outrageous. It was an intrusion into my space, but I didn't mind the stream. It seemed natural at some level, but it wasn't silent. It wasn't at all silent. So I think we have different attunements to those three categories of sound. Like where I lived, our silence has been absolutely wrecked, really, by the building of a very large wind farm. I hate the turbine noise. It's not very noisy, but I hate it. My neighbour absolutely loves it. Why does she love it? Because she grew up by the seaside, and it's a quite calm place, just because it was. And she says the turbines sound just like the waves breaking on the beach. It makes her feel like a child again. She loves it. So it's not that the sound is bad or good, it's that it's a big change. I really, really don't like it. So I don't think that Bernie Krause's soundscape language solves all the problems, but what it does suggest is that what we're hearing is deeply complicated, and we tend not to listen to what we hear. And I've found being able to think about sounds within that sort of language has opened me very much up to better sort of listening. Well, the listening of the soundscape around me has become deeper, more meaningful. I find it very interesting to listen to what you hear and work out where it's coming from. It's given me a vocabulary for that. There's another reason, though, why this business about silence in nature isn't simple. And I'm afraid this is another bit of science. It's called attenuation, and sound travels differently according to how hot and dry the air is. The hot dryness kills off sound. Cold wetness encourages sound. This is why deserts are so silent. Although there's nearly always a wind in the desert, which is moving sand about, the noise that it makes dies sooner. I've spent quite a lot of time in deserts that I'm very keen on. And when you're first in a desert, hearing a camel cough at night, they cough a lot, they have the most revolting habits, camels, let's not speak about camels exactly, but they make a sound and it closes almost immediately. So it's very disruptive, but the disruption is incredibly short. And I said to somebody, why is that? And they said, because the air is so dry. It's a scientifically measurable thing, which I can't scientifically measure. But so there's a whole lot of forces that come into play. And obviously deserts are famously silent, which is why those 4th century hermits went off into them, and St. Athanasius, who was a particularly committed to silence person, used to go and tell young monks that they ought to move immediately because there was a small shrub within 100 yards of their house, and they couldn't hope to do any praying with that endless noise. He didn't think that sand deserts were as good as rock deserts because sand moves more, and therefore it was more noisy. I don't believe, including myself, that there's very many people capable of even hearing that difference now. Not enough, anyway. So deserts don't have very many sound makers to start with, and the ones they have cut off much quicker because of the dryness of the air. which means it's going to be quieter in Spain than it is in England. And it's going to be quieter in England than it is in Scotland. Because, goodness me, is it wetter in Scotland? Is it just dry all the time? Or are you having a dry patch? You're having a dry patch. Sorry?
It depends on the area. Normally Spain is wet. It can be wetter, not much wetter.
Okay. No, we just noticed driving about how relatively speaking dry it was. And we've had one of the wettest years ever in Scotland. So presumably it's noisier. I can't say I've really noticed this in much detail myself. But deserts don't have any running water. That's kind of one of their features. They do have sand. They don't have any much vegetation to make wind noises. And the sun cuts off very early. And that's why deserts are so kind of famously silent. Why perhaps silence, which is what I want to move on to now, has become so associated, why spirituality, why prayer has become so associated with silence, is because they were doing so much of it in deserts when they started. I mean, silent prayer emerged in desert communities, and then they went and found even more desert to do it in. In the Hebrew scriptures, there's a story about Elijah. And Elijah had been having an extremely noisy time, all right, including massacring, so far as we can discover, single-handedly 400 priests of Baal, summoning an exceptionally uncalled for fire, and then running all the way to the king's palace to tell the king that it was about to rain. And not surprisingly, the king's wife, who was Jezebel, was not very pleased with him, so she thought she'd have him killed. So he ran away, and he ran away into the desert. Actually went on a 40-day trek into the desert to escape from his thing. And it was only when he was quiet that he was able to listen. And so having sat around saying to God, kill me, everything's hopeless, it is all useless, I am so miserable, he goes up this mountain, Mount Horeb, and sits there, and that's when he hears the rushing wind, and God is not in the rushing wind. He hears the rocks all falling down, an earthquake, and God is not in the earthquake. And then he hears what is in the English classical translation, the still small voice. But in fact, that's not a good translation. I don't know how you translate it. In Hebrew, people say what he hears is the voice of sheer or pure silence. And after he's listened to it, he feels quite calm again, gets on with life, knows what to do, and the plot moves forward again. That sense of desert as being the place you go to regroup yourself, ideally not after hands slaughtering 400 priests of Baal. That's probably not a good way for us nowadays to experiment with silence, but that is going into a silent place and listening to the silence has proved key not just to creativity, but also not just to spirituality, but also to artistic work. The idea that if you want to hear your own silent inner voice and contemplate on that and generate the new thing, you need to put some silence around you. Now, there are, as there are with everything, some exceptions to that, but almost all serious creative artists need some solitude and some silence. And so do serious prayers, spirituality. I'm really interested in what that is about, because actually, in most traditions, prayer and artistic work are exactly the opposite. The job of mystical prayer is to silence your inner voice so you can hear God's. The idea of creativity is to silence the external voices so you can hear your own. So why the same method should produce two such completely opposite ends, I honestly don't know the answer. I really don't know the answer. but I am intrigued by the fact that the same method has been used for at least 3,000 years to get to such opposite ends, so that our romantic poets were always taking off in extremely uncomfortable places, going for very long walks in very quiet places, in order to repudiate the conventions of God at exactly the same time as a whole lot of nuns and monks were pushing off up mountains to live in hermitages in order to be aware of the voice of God. But there is some interiority in silence that I suppose I worry that we will lose if we don't learn to listen to silence. And the easiest place to listen to it, for me, is in nature, in things that have been as little touched by culture as possible. Of course, they've all been touched by culture, because here I am talking about it, and language is culture. So there is a kind of complicated circularity, but it worries me, I think, a lot that, for example, we want our children to be creative. We give them no practice in silence. Now, actually, everybody who's had a 2-year-old in the house knows that sociability does not come naturally. You know, the number of times you have to say, share your toys, don't bite Tommy. It is not natural for a child to act unselfishly in the world. It needs some cultural training in this, and we all impose it. But we never impose or offer children the opposite. So I don't know, again, enough about Spanish contemporary culture. A quite common punishment, now we don't whack them so much as we used to, is to send children to their room. Go to your room. That's a punishment. I've never heard a mother say, darling, you've been so helpful all afternoon that you could go up to your room and be alone and quiet as a special reward. Don't know why not. We want them to be creative and thoughtful. We ought to be providing them with practices in silence. And the one that I think we're losing a lot at the moment is the idea that children should go out into nature by themselves. Now, I don't know how it is here, and I certainly wouldn't wish to be heard as telling you what you ought to be doing with your children. But English children spend less and less time outside at all, and less time on their own. And it is, if you discuss that, and sociologists talk about it, it is fear, despite the fact there has been no increase in stranger murder of children since the 50s. In Britain, it's been almost entirely flat, except for the year of a major disaster we had about, which is called Dunblane, when psychopath, I think it would be fair to say, went and shot an entire playground of children, but they weren't alone. It was meant to be a safe place. They were in the school playground. So I think that people are frightened of being alone. They're frightened of loneliness. I think some people need more than others, I really do, but kids don't get a chance now to find out what they need, and I think the most accessible way they could have that is age-appropriate experiences of the silence of nature, which is certainly better than the silence of being locked in a basement. A great deal better, although probably about the same amount of silence. So I think I have a kind of, for me, increasingly, nature, silence, well-being. Freely chosen silence is very good for people. Imposed silence is very bad for people. If you put somebody in compulsory isolation, it really is not good for them. It's not good. I don't want to go off on that now. But I think, when I remember back to my own childhood, we lived in London, but we spent quite a lot of time in Scotland, and I think I'm just deeply grateful to my parents that they did not hover us around with fears of being out there, with fears of listening to it, with the whole thing being scary and something bad might happen. Because I think it's a cultural dimension that some people need to flourish, whether you want to use a vocabulary of introversion, extroversion, or some other vocabulary. I think that some people need more silence, and they're the ones who aren't getting it. Yeah, there are also some people who need extremely little silence, and some people who hate it. But you know, there's some people who hate ice cream, and we don't think that children shouldn't have ice cream. Sorry, that's a stupid example. But I just think the silence of nature outside the urban, domestic racket is a really precious treasure for those who want it, that we are not allowing ourselves to access. We don't want to think about it. We think it's too scary, it's too big, it's too bad. But I cannot see other than the right place to learn it is in a very beautiful rural place. And I suppose that is really what I want to say, that the silence of nature is particularly beautiful because it is profoundly underlies all the power that is so exciting and positive about nature. I think maybe I'd stop there and